Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming on an unexpectedly warm and humid spring day. I'm coming from Toronto, and I always prepare, for colder weather here, but I was surprised when I arrived. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming in what promises to be a rich and important discussion. My name's Peter Copeland. I'm the Deputy Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Domestic Policy Program. And it's a really fitting conversation and theme for us in this, our 15th year as an institute. 15 years ago, MLI was founded with a clear ambition to breathe life into Canada's political tradition, not just to generate new policy and make bad policy unacceptable, which we like to say, but to remind Canadians of the deep roots and serious ideas that built this country. And that ambition is inscribed in our name, Macdonald and Laurier, the founding Tory and great Liberal, a gesture that I think affirms our commitment not to one ideology, but to a broader civic inheritance that transcends the partisan fevers of the day. And, rather than a myopic fixation on reacting to the latest news or the latest polling bump with whatever seems most popular, it's this grounding in Canadian political tradition that has made MLI distinctive among think tanks. And it's why today is so fitting. For our 15th year, we're here to talk about legacy, about statesmanship, and about history. And about two figures who loom very large in our national story: Sir John A. Macdonald, the architect of Confederation, and John Diefenbaker, the prairie populist who challenged the establishment in the name of liberty and dignity. Both men, very different, yet each profoundly Canadian, helped shape the country we now inhabit. And yet, as we'll explore today, their place in public memory is far from settled. Macdonald is the subject of controversy, and Diefenbaker has all but disappeared from view. And I think that raises a deeper question, one I hope we can wrestle with. Can a society like ours, we hear all these post-terms, post-materialist, post-modern, even post-national, can it still take its history seriously? Or have we, in seeking liberation from the past, also severed ourselves from its meaning? And I think, it's easy to lay the blame for this at the feet of what we call wokeness. But perhaps the challenge is deeper than that, a culmination of an overemphasis on core elements, even of liberalism itself, which for all its merits has tended to prioritize autonomy over belonging, abstraction over rootedness, and the universal over the particular. And if that's the case, I'd say, the real threat to historical memory may not be radical ideology, but the long arc of hyper-individualism unmoored from tradition and place. So, after all, if you can belong anywhere, then you may also perhaps belong nowhere, and owe no deep commitment to people's places or even to one's own history. So, I put that question to you to think about during today's conversation. And in this kind of society, can we still honor our forebears? Or must every legacy stand trial with the decks stacked increasingly against them? And thankfully, today we have two authors with us who are not afraid to ask those questions or to tell a fuller story. Patrice Dutil is a professor, editor, and longtime student of Canadian political development. His new books, Ballots and Brawls, The Ordeal of the 1917 Election, and last year's Sir John A. and the Apocalyptic 1885, dive into foundational moments in Canada's life, stories of high ideals, fierce division, and real national stakes. And with him is Bob Plamondon, a renowned historian who's just released Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker, and The Dream of Canada, a spirited and deeply researched account of one of our most singular prime ministers, a man driven by conscience, often ahead of his time, and often out of step with the establishment. And together they're here not only to revisit the lives and legacies of these two great figures, but to help us think more seriously about what kind of people we want to be, a country that remembers or a country that forgets. So without further ado, please welcome me in joining Patrice Dutil and Bob Plamondon. Thank you, gentlemen. So we'll start simple. What drew you both to writing about Macdonald and Diefenbaker? What made them compelling figures for you?
Should I start because chronologically I come first?
Yes.
You're younger too.
Sir John A. Macdonald has been a subject of study for me for about 15 years now, and what drew me to it was actually Richard Gwynn's 2-volume biography, and I enjoyed it so much, but with every page I said, there's more to the story, there's more to the story. And that drew me in, and so I brought together a study team of scholars, and we put together a book called Sir John A. Macdonald at 200, New Perspectives and Legacies. That came out in 2015 for the 200th anniversary. But as I was writing my chapters for that book and reflecting on the evolution of the Prime Minister's office, you know, the way it has evolved over the last 150 years, again, Macdonald kept looming larger and larger. I think that the office of the Prime Minister, we think today as a highly centralized office. It is a highly centralized office, but it was a highly centralized office in Sir John A.'s time. So I see that evolution as really a statement of continuity. It changes form with modernity, but that centrifugal force of the Prime Minister, the force of personality, goes back to 1867. Anyway, long story short, 1885 kept coming back and coming back and coming back, and I said maybe there's a good project here. There's a book on that one particular year that seemed to challenge Macdonald at every turn, at every month. And I think it's a study of a Prime Minister that is making decisions on issues big and small, at the same time innovating, not being swayed from his agenda, and yet dealing with major crises, international crisis. That's why I called it the apocalyptic 1885. It's almost as if Sir John A. Macdonald was facing the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And it was unrelenting. And yet he's innovating, he's trying new things, he's responding, and he certainly doesn't shy away from making really tough decisions. Macdonald really, I think, deserves enormous credit for what he did. And my study is an attempt to bring him into context.
Okay. Yeah, so he laid the first stone, and his presence very much still felt.
Let me just add to something that Patrice did not say, but it's probably implied, is that his book took great courage. Because at the time you were writing this book, Macdonald was consistently under attack. You could almost not say his name. I can't imagine what the initial reactions were to you proposing this idea from agents and publishers. But one of the few lone voices, well, there were others, but one of the few voices that stood up for Macdonald at a time when there is much we can learn from him today, and his place in history has been,
thanks for that,
somewhat restored. We still have work to do.
We have a long way to go.
So, my task was not as monumental, but I begin with the premise. This is my 6th book on Canada, and I've studied leadership on the conservative side and the liberal side as well. But it begins with the premise that Canada is an improbable country. On paper, does it make sense that we exist? Look at our the geography that we span, multiple languages, the diversity, how different we are, multicultural in so many different ways, and somehow we've managed to keep the country together, we've united, we've prospered, we've done great things, and it's because at various points in time in our history we've had exceptional political leadership. And we are well served when we are reminded about who we are as a country from examining our past. What's worked, what hasn't worked, these issues tend to recur. So I'm naturally drawn to this. And I like to do somewhat counterweights in my book. I did a book about Pierre Trudeau after there had been a collection of hundreds of books about Trudeau, calling him the best prime minister ever. And I called him the most damaging prime minister in Canadian history. I did a book about Jean Chrétien, who was known as this sort of small-town hick from Shawinigan, Quebec. It was, simpleton. It couldn't read a briefing note, and the brains behind the operation was Paul Martin. The reality is that Chrétien was giving a master class in politics, and we can learn from him still. So what about Diefenbaker? What do we know about John Diefenbaker? Well, we know if you asked, did it across the street, to the extent people have heard of him, they would say, oh, he was the guy who canceled the Avro Arrow, and he caved in to the Americans. If there's anything John Diefenbaker wasn't going to do, was cave in to the Americans. Or he sacked the governor of the Bank of Canada. He was paranoid. He was a cartoon character. He was a buffoon. The reality is, he was one of Canada's greatest prime ministers, that he was almost always on the right side of history, doing big things, standing up for individual rights. So the title of the book is Freedom Fighter, because intrinsically, growing up in poverty, growing up in small town Ontario and then in Saskatchewan, growing up with a Germanic surname, which was not an asset after Canada had just fought two world wars with Great Britain. There's so much that he overcame. He ran in 5 federal and provincial elections, went 0 for 5 before finally getting a seat in 1940. But my book is about what he did during his political career, running twice for leadership and getting creamed, finally winning it on the 3rd time, not because the power brokers in the party thought that he was due, or the elites, or Bay Street was on side. It was because the people insisted on it. And what did that mean to be a prairie populist who was deeply connected with ordinary Canadians, to have someone like that in the Prime Minister's office? He used to say, I have this deep connection with ordinary Canadians. He says, I can't help it because I'm one of them. And his list of accomplishments, whether it's the Bill of Rights, when no one was talking about individual rights, trying to divert trade away from the United States and towards other countries. That sounds like we could learn some lessons from that now.
Yeah.
The first Indigenous person in the Senate, first parliamentarian, first woman in cabinet, extended the right to vote to Indigenous people. So, in my book, I've got an extensive chapter on both Canada's relations and Diefenbaker's relations with Indigenous people. And it's, we've got a number of authors here, great historians. I have this view that every great figure needs a new biography at least every generation, because the issues and circumstances change. The last great book on Diefenbaker was Dennis Smith in 1995. Well, in that entire book, there were 2 references to Indigenous issues. So it was a fresh look, and to put him, he wasn't a perfect prime minister, and he hung on a little bit longer as in the leadership after he was defeated than he should. But he is one of Canada's greatest prime ministers, and I think that was a story worth telling because of what we can learn from him.
And you're thinking our answers are way too long.
Well, you're going to go back and forth, I think. You go long, you go short. I'll do my best. But a lot of themes there that we're going to delve into deeply today. Leadership styles, character and personality, some of the trends with respect to that. Relationship with the U.S., absolutely. But first, let's talk about Ballots and Brawls in 1885, Patrice. A time of political ferment, you are quite right to note. And I think it's fair to say, although of course our historical knowledge generally is not that good, Canadians don't necessarily think of big events at that time. They don't associate our founding with that. But in fact, as you write, a lot of significant issues, even violence in the election. So help us understand that and how some of that ferment and the lessons learned from then might apply to today.
Ballots and Brawls is about the election of 1867, the very first election in Canada. It is an election that's never been covered. There's no book about it. There's hardly a mention. The big biographies of Macdonald, of George Brown. There's nothing on Samuel Tilley. There's nothing on Tupper. This is the election that's been forgotten. And yet, the 1867 election was the election that confirmed Canada. This was fundamentally an important election. And what I did in Ballots and Brawls is document a contest that took place in a very different world where there was no communications, there were no railways, there were no national campaigns. Every issue was very local. I talk about, for example, the contest in Ontario being a contest between Macdonald and Brown, two Scotsmen. I mean, it was a Scottish election in Ontario. In Quebec, it was between Dorion, the liberal, the sort of liberal reformist, and Georges-Étienne Cartier, Sir John A. Macdonald's right-hand man, arguably the most important architect of Confederation. In Nova Scotia, it's Charles Tupper, Dr. Charles Tupper, who is this mean son of a bitch. I shouldn't use that language, I'm being recorded. But Tupper was an extraordinary character, but he's facing Joseph Howe, who's an even more extraordinary character. Talk about a battle of titans. And Tupper gets creamed because Nova Scotia votes secession. They don't want to be a part of Canada. They want to be a part of Britain. And most people vote. 60% of people vote against Confederation. Can you imagine today if 60% of Alberta said we're going to support a secessionist, or we've come close to that in Quebec, where 60% of people in Quebec voted for the Bloc? We'd have a crisis. They had this in 1867. And then New Brunswick, which was a contest of liberals between Samuel Leonard Tilley, and a fellow that a fellow called Timothy Anglin, who's completely forgotten, but who in his day was a real wit. And so 1867, my point of 1867 is that this was a contest that should have divided Canadians, and it actually did divide Canadians, but it didn't because Sir John A. Macdonald, and he was Sir John A. Macdonald already at that point, somehow managed to cover it up. He covered it up. And this, in a sense that he didn't pick on the divisions. He could have picked on the divisions. George Brown, who was defeated, shades of today, the leader who is defeated in his own riding, could have insisted on the divisions. And the elite did not do it. They very carefully covered it up. And I think that magic trick set Canada on its wheels and set it into a forward direction. So my book on Ballots and Brawls is really about this strange contest, full of ideas, full of doubt, and yet triumphant for Sir John A., who manages to win the election even though he won a minority of the votes. I mean, he won a plurality, but it was a small plurality.
Yeah. Well, admirable qualities to seize not on divisions, but seek unity.
It takes tremendous
things that we could definitely learn
Yes.
today in our social media age.
He also had Queen Victoria on his side too, which helped.
It's always an asset to have the monarch on your side. The monarch is coming back.
Bob, what about Diefenbaker? You alluded to many of his traits in your opening remarks there. Crusader for liberty, a man of the people, quite down to earth. How do you think contemporary Canadians, understand or misunderstand him, and what could they learn from him?
Well, the misunderstanding of his character was that he was out of step in time. We had, when he came into power, Dwight Eisenhower was the president of the United States, and they were probably generationally more compatible and thought more along the same lines. That didn't mean that he didn't disagree with Eisenhower. They did on China, when Canada was selling wheat to China. Both Eisenhower and Kennedy objected. But when John F. Kennedy came in, it was a different world. So they not only was he younger, somewhat more vibrant, there was quite a contrast with Diefenbaker. It seemed like he was out of step in time. And Kennedy thought that Canada should simply be a satellite of the United States. The only answer that he was prepared to accept from John Diefenbaker when the request was made was, yes, sir. And Diefenbaker was a man of destiny. He was a man of courage. He was a man who could not be intimidated, even by the force of Kennedy's, magnetic power. So, and in the midst of this, we have the Cold War. That was quite a dramatic event for everyone, even in your own household. You were practicing in your household what to do in the case of a nuclear attack. And bomb shelters were being built in the backyards. And here's, Diefenbaker, cautioning about some of the saber rattling that was going on out of the United States, which, was, quite significant during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But to your point about how he's misunderstood, let me just deal first with the Avro Arrow, which is, sort of the number one thing that people think about. So before the 1957 election, which Diefenbaker was expected to lose, and surprisingly won, and one of the surprise was in the previous 9 elections, the Liberals had won. The Conservatives had won only once. The elites in the Tory party thought this Diefenbaker is going to be one and done, and we'll get back to somebody from the Albany Club to take over again, who's friendly with Bay Street. We'll let this populist have his shot, and then out he'll go. Surprisingly, he wins that election. The Cold War is at its height. And the Americans want to put nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. The threat at the time during the Cold War was not that the Russians were going to come over Canada with bombers and fly over Canada and drop their bombs in the United States. The threat was intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Avro Arrow was going to do nothing in response to intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so that at the time, the military, before the 57 election, had proposed that the Avro Arrow be scrapped. It had a great, it had remarkable qualities. It was a great feat of engineering, but it didn't respond to the military threat. It was incredibly expensive. The only way that it could have been economical is if there was a demand for it around the world by our allies. There wasn't any demand. We just had built a couple of prototypes, none of which flew with any weapons on them. So the military had said, this is not where we need to put our money. The government of Louis Saint Laurent had determined to cancel the Avro Arrow, but they didn't want to do it before the 57 election because there was a couple of seats at stake, and they were going to put off the decision. The bureaucracy had determined that they were going to cancel the Avro Arrow. So all signs pointed in that direction. And it wasn't American pressure that led to the cancellation. The only pressure that the Americans really put on it was to say, we're not going to buy your plane. And so that was like a nail in the coffin. But that didn't stop the CBC from producing what is their highest rated documentary of all time on the Avro Arrow. They even brought up Dan Aykroyd to play the role of Crawford, who was the CEO of the Avro company. It's their highest rated documentary, and you'd think the CBC would be in the nation building business. This documentary was an exercise in slander on John Diefenbaker to sort of, and even with my book, the most email I get from this book is, I can't believe you're apologizing for Diefenbaker on the Arrow, but the record is clear that this was a losing proposition for Canada.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, when you say populist, I mean we see many of them today, and you've noted, Patrice, the unifying elements of Sir John A.'s character. How do their personality traits and leadership styles, how did that affect their success or failure as prime ministers? And then what lessons do you think they have for leaders today?
Well, you go first because Diefenbaker built on Macdonald.
Diefenbaker loved Macdonald.
He did.
He loved Macdonald. Their characters, Sir John A. Never fails to impress me in that sense. Let's not forget that Sir John A. Macdonald won 6 majorities. Mackenzie King may have lasted 24 months longer than Sir John A., but nobody's won 6 majorities. And that's pretty impressive. How did he do it? He had an exquisite sense of timing. He knew, Sir John A. Macdonald would never have canceled the Avro Arrow. I don't think he would have done that. He would have, downsized it and let it peter out on its own. He had an exquisite sense of timing when he, when after the election of 1867, I'll start with that example to encapsulate a little bit what I mean. There's only one MP elected from Nova Scotia, a Conservative, and it's Charles Tupper. But he has, when he went into the election, Macdonald had another, a senator in cabinet, and that senator disappeared. He died or he withdrew. I can't remember exactly the circumstance. And Macdonald left the position vacant until he could get Joseph Howe to join his cabinet. And it took a year. And that's the finesse of Sir John A. He knew, he sort of let the idea go that there is going to be a cabinet position for Nova Scotia, but he had to find the right guy. He could have put anybody in there, but he waited for the big fish, Joseph Howe, and he convinced Joseph Howe to join. And so in 1872, after a remarkable run of success, I mean, Sir John A. Macdonald's first ministry, the cabinet from 67 to 72, is extraordinary accomplishments, one after the other. Dare I go through the whole thing? I mean, the expansion of Canada coast to coast, the admission of British Columbia, the admission of PI, the acquisition of Rupert's Land. I mean, it goes on and on. What they accomplished was remarkable. And so he was able to present to the people of Canada in 1872 a remarkable set of accomplishments. Now, he was corrupt, and he took money from the railways in order to win. And, he got punished in 1873 and 1874 for that. But, in 1874, he still got 40% of the vote. I mean, people were still behind him. And he comes back in 78. In the book on Sir John A. Macdonald and the apocalyptic 1885, I talk about the consequence, which is the election of 1887. And he wins triumphantly. He loses a few seats, but he keeps the popular vote. People, even in Quebec, are more than willing to forgive Macdonald for the hanging of Louis Riel. And his victory in 1891 is even greater. So the notion that Quebec revolted against Sir John A. or Sir John A. Macdonald's conservatism is flat wrong. Macdonald kept the support because he stood for a certain vision of the country. He was able to defend his record, and of course, he was able to mock the Liberals, who were led by a whole bunch of people who had real difficulty connecting with Canadians compared to Sir John A. So, to answer your question, I mean, it was not the kind of populism you have today because the means of communications are not the same. But people were convinced of Macdonald's vision for the country, and that more than sufficed.
So, building on that, let me talk about where Diefenbaker aligned with Macdonald and where he didn't. He was certainly aligned with Macdonald on vision, and they were attracted to the concept of Canada because to resist American manifest destiny. Yeah. So this is how we bring Macdonald brought and expanded the colonies into one to create a more powerful force to resist that destiny. So that was part to resist the American, but also they believed in the traditions, in the monarchy, in the Magna Carta, Petition of Rights, the Bill of Rights, and all that the Conservative Party stood for. Diefenbaker said on why he chose the Conservative Party, it's because they were the party that believed more so than any other in an independent Canada.
Yes.
So Diefenbaker was inspired by Macdonald. He used his inkwell. He used his desk. He slept in his bed, although they had to extend it. So the bed, because it was, it was not long enough. Whenever he would feel under stress at the time from the burdens of the office, he'd pick up Donald Creighton's book on Sir John A. to read about the struggles and how he overcame the burdens of office. He spoke of Macdonald's national vision as being foundational to who we are as Canadians. Diefenbaker came forward with a northern vision, like Macdonald had a national vision, which is his Roads to Resources project, which in 6 years built 6,000 kilometers of roads to the far north to open up our forestry, our mining, our oil and gas. And this was not only about developing our resources, but Canadians developing those resources to have more control and of our own economy. So he very much lined up with Macdonald, except with one respect. And this has to do with Quebec and the French. Macdonald, famously said, treat the French as a nation, and they'll respond as all nations do generously. Treat them as a fascist, and they'll become a fraction, and they'll become fascists. So he did recognize that Quebec was, in many respects, a nation within a state, whereas Diefenbaker believed in one Canada. He wrote his autobiography, 3 volumes. In all 3 volumes, the first 2 words are one Canada. And in fact, that's why he held on to the leadership of the party after he left, because he could see during the Quiet Revolution in Quebec and the nationalism that was emerging, he saw that as a threat. He thought very much like Pierre Trudeau at the time in his view of Quebec, that it should be a province like every other province, that every province should be treated completely equally within their domains. And he had a bit of a tin ear when it came to the cultural linguistic sensitivity that was emerging in the province of Quebec, and that ultimately led to divisions within the party over the flag debate, which he was opposed to the adoption of that particular flag at that time using that process. Because in his mind, equality meant equality for all, not giving any one citizen or group of citizens or province any other special privileges and rights. So, on that respect, I would say he was far less nuanced than was Macdonald in cobbling together English and French as he did, to unite the country.
Very good. Well, I think it's clear these leaders they're bold, they're visionary, courageous, statesmanly. I think it's fair to say, but welcome your thoughts on this, that the quality of political leadership or the people being attracted to politics may have declined in recent years, recent decades. Perhaps that's due to, overemphasis on PR and polling and style over substance, to this idea that politics is dumbed down a little bit today, that you need to be constantly reacting to the 24/7 news cycle. So it may not be attracting the same quality of candidates. Would you agree with that characterization? How do you think leadership styles have changed over time? Curious for your thoughts. Bob, let's start with you this time.
So Diefenbaker was an incredible campaigner. He's in the 1957 election, he was supposed to lose. 1958, he wins the largest Canadian majority of all time on a proportionate basis. People just loved him. They wanted to hear him. They wanted to touch his coat. He had this charisma about him, which seems kind of odd when you see the images of him now. He doesn't have this sort of projecting this good looks. And even if you read his speeches, they weren't all that great. But when he delivered them with the passion that he delivered, he was a terrific campaigner, and he had a sense of humor, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Which might be a little different from today's politicians. When you just think of a few things that he said. When Pierre Trudeau, age 51, married Margaret Sinclair, age 21. He was
22.
22?
I'm just joking.
Okay, well, you put another historian on the table. And, okay, game on.
I'm
buddy.
just joking.
Game
I'm
on.
just joking. She was older than you think.
She was 22. She was
Just
so
joking.
so Diefenbaker said, well, he had 2 choices. He could either marry her or adopt her.
How'd it go over?
So when Richard Nixon, then President Nixon, criticized Pierre Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, Diefenbaker took offense because Nixon had called Trudeau, you said bitch, I'll say asshole. He called...
We're being recorded here.
I know, but this is history, so we gotta, we're not,
No censorship,
We're not woke here. This is what was said. So Richard Nixon called Pierre Trudeau an asshole. Diefenbaker came to Trudeau's defense to say, this is not appropriate for a foreign leader to be speaking ill of our prime minister. However, President Nixon has demonstrated an excellent knowledge of human anatomy.
let me
You know,
let me
lost some of the
respond to the
humor.
issue of that
Yeah, I
old,
want a real answer to the question too. I was good, careful.
Well, you were asking about about today. How
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
different,
Anyway,
you know?
Patrice.
that old man's lament about how politicians today are not what they used to be.
Yeah.
Sir John A., like Diefenbaker, loved to campaign. Again, dealing in the 19th century when travel is a lot more difficult. From 1867 onwards, you can tell that Macdonald is on the campaign trail, even though it's not very well documented. Even with today's technology, it was impossible for me to track Macdonald's day-to-day travels. The election in 1867 took place from the end of July until mid-September, and he only stayed in Ontario. He didn't go beyond Ontario. But the clue that I have about Macdonald's intensity in campaigning is the fact that his correspondence ends in late July. It is over. And he will not resume correspondence until mid-September. Agnes Macdonald, his wife, stops her journal in late September and then starts again at the end of September saying, oh, it's been so long and I feel so bad that I haven't recorded what happened in the last 8 weeks. Boy, talk about an insult to the historian. Why didn't you write your thoughts? You've robbed us of history. But it tells you that the campaign in 1867 was massively intense. And like Diefenbaker, Macdonald liked to visit with the people. You know, that was his expression, I want to visit with the people. And Macdonald did that. Same in 1887, after the 2 years, after the momentous year of 1885. But to answer your question, though, Peter, about the quality of people, in 1867 and in 1885, Macdonald did not have the communications that we have today. He needed to have lieutenants in the regions to work through, to communicate his message. So he does that in 1887, and he does that in 1867. I document in 1867 how he used McDougall as a hound on George Brown, using Georges-Étienne Cartier in Quebec, using Tilley in New Brunswick, using Tupper in Nova Scotia. All these guys were extremely accomplished. Tupper, a leading doctor, an eminent doctor in Nova Scotia. Tilley, a pharmacist who was a retailer. Georges-Étienne Cartier, lawyer to the Jesuits, lawyer to the Grand Trunk, lawyer to anybody who was elite. Georges-Étienne Cartier knew everybody in Quebec. He worked with these guys who were leaders in their field. He was looking for leadership. That's what made Macdonald especially good. And he did that again in 1887 when the leadership was failing in the difficult years of 1885. He reconstitutes his cabinet. He stops in August of 1885 and rebuilds his cabinet. And again, you know, when you're restructuring the plane mid-flight, that takes a lot of guts, and he did it. You know, he managed. So working through high-quality people was his method.
Sort of to challenge somewhat the premise of your question, Diefenbaker didn't become prime minister because of his CV. He had run, you know, a 2 or a 3-person law office. That's it. Then he was an MP from 1940 until 1956 when he became the leader. And he wasn't even well liked, certainly among the elites within his party and those that had gone to, you know, had elite education or who had money. You know, he was very much a man of the people. So you would say he didn't come into office highly credentialed, but people knew whose side he was on. It was that sentiment that was most important. So when he had a career as a lawyer, always taking on the cases that others wouldn't take on, the capital crime offenses. He would defend Indigenous people when others wouldn't take them on. In fact, in Saskatchewan, one of his first cases that he took on were 2 school board trustees who were charged with a crime because they were offering French language education in Saskatchewan when the provincial government thought that was against their rules. He defended the rights of those trustees and got them an acquittal. So I don't think you could say that he came in as having demonstrated outside of the world of politics or in international affairs great accomplishment. Lester Pearson, by contrast, had the credentials, had the education, even had the Nobel Peace Prize at the time, and he cleaned Pearson in the 1958 election, and he won 3 elections in a row. He won a minority government after that. So he wins 3 elections in a row in his own party that effectively took him down before he won in 62, but in the 1963 election it was his own party that took him down. So it wasn't an extensive CV that endeared him to Canadians.
Fair. Maybe more what I was getting at is character, but
that's a different matter.
That's a different matter. We have lots more to discuss. So another common thread between the two is their conservatism. Wondering if you could elaborate on that. What made them conservative, and how does that differ or remain consistent with the conservatism of today? And you were seeing people like Poilievre, for example, invoke the legacy of Macdonald. Do you think it's wise or risky for contemporary leaders to refer back to some of their forebears?
That's a tough question. I saw Mr. Poilievre mention Macdonald obliquely in the sense that, and I think he was right to do it, that Macdonald had phenomenal ambition. And if we could bottle that kind of ambition for our country, it would lead us, I think, in a proper direction. Macdonald's conservatism is a constant concern. In the book on 1885, I capture Macdonald in a remarkable number of progressive stances. Macdonald was not a conservative the way we think of conservatism today. He bragged and always labeled himself as a liberal-conservative, and often chided the liberal opposition for not being progressive enough. Look at the issue around Indigenous people. Macdonald was way ahead of the Liberals in terms of supporting the Indigenous people, in terms of he gives them the right to vote in 1885. The constant support he brings to the Indigenous people is frankly impressive compared to what the Liberals did, taking away the vote from the Indigenous people and diminishing the size of their reserves, diminishing the subsidies to the Indigenous. On that front, even though Macdonald has been condemned in this country practically universally, Macdonald's record on Indigenous people is phenomenal. I can go on about that. But it's liberal conservative. Macdonald was a conservative, and it's undeniable in the sense that he really sought to preserve the essence of our British inheritance. And that captured the sense of relying on common law, of a slightly restrained state in most areas, but at the same time conscious of the fact that you are building a society in a conservative way, working organically to transfer the will of the people into a common good. A fundamentally conservative perspective. So for me, you ask him what kind of conservative he was a liberal conservative. I think Canada today is a liberal conservative society. Some would call it a progressive conservative society. We don't call it that anymore, but I think that was the image of Macdonald.
Fascinating.
So Diefenbaker was not particularly ideological. And if you looked at his campaigns, he didn't put progressive conservative front and center. His campaign slogans were "Follow John." John's the leader. Where his alignment with conservatism would be the history, aligning with the monarchy, and he was counter to I would say the conservative ideology at the time, where there was a fear of socialism. There was a fear of government overreach, of government spending. And Diefenbaker didn't hesitate to put in programs that he thought would genuinely help poor people. He wasn't saying, if you're in the middle class, I want to raise you up. No, he thought, I'm going to help the people who are most in need. So whether it was in old age pensions, which the Liberals are rather parsimonious with it, he said, I'll index the old age pensions with inflation. He was the one that implemented publicly funded hospital care in Canada, including for those with mental health, which is, again, putting him way ahead of his time, far more sensitive to those issues. I would say philosophically, he was an ardent anti-communist and delivered great speeches worldwide against the dangers of communism and even socialism. But he didn't come to office with a fixed set of ideas other than, it's one Canada and I'm going to support individual rights and freedoms. He was more incremental, from a policy perspective. He had more cabinet meetings than any other prime minister during the times that, that he was in office. And he launched more royal commissions than any other prime minister that I can think of. He wanted these issues studied. He wanted experts to chime in on them. It wasn't done for philosophical reasons. He wanted to make incremental progress in the nation and solve these problems. So he didn't come in with a fixed set of ideas. He did get criticized heavily for incurring deficits, because after Second World War, we'd had surpluses, the debt was going down, and all of a sudden we had two recessions, one when he first came into office and another that essentially followed worldwide patterns. And he said, look, if I have the choice of supporting the poor who are hurt by a recession or balancing the books, I'm going to help the poor. Mm-hmm. So philosophically, I would say he's not far off from
No, not at all. Macdonald also launched a number of royal commissions. Macdonald always ran a deficit, and he had no problems with that at all. Both of them were eminently practically minded. They really sought to have practical solutions to practical problems. The Indigenous people are hungry out west. Let's, first of all, protect them. Let's make sure that we have sovereignty over the territory. Can you imagine if Canada had not secured the sovereignty over the territory starting in 1867, 68, 69? What would have happened to the Indigenous people out west, the 15,000, 20,000 people, had the border been left open? They would not be there. Macdonald protected them. Macdonald fed them. He provided rations. Some people did go hungry. That argument against Macdonald stands, but very, very few people died of starvation. Some people went hungry, absolutely no doubt. But Macdonald tried to find practical solutions to the problem, and I document that in the book on 1885.
Unlike the Americans who just went to war.
Exactly.
With Indigenous
annihilated
people.
them.
Yeah. Well, very good. No, I think we can clearly see the traces of both styles, sets of views in contemporary Canadian political parties. You both mentioned earlier Manifest Destiny and reaction to that as being key to their visions. And of course, it's back in the news today, so to speak. In the recent federal election, many think that fear of the U.S. and of Trump's, aggression was a key factor in the decision. What does this most recent, resurfacing of a long-standing issue tell us about Canadians' perception of the U.S. today and how it compares to the past? And tell us more about how Macdonald and Diefenbaker viewed the relationship with the U.S. and how that shaped their vision.
So they both had massive disputes with the U.S. Macdonald particularly on the fishery, but we didn't have control. I'll let you answer that question, of course, over our international affairs at the time that was done.
Well, no, I think Sir John established control over Canada. John A. Macdonald created the Atlantic Triangle. Let's not be coy about this. Britain and Washington, London and Washington had this nice bilateral relationship, and talk about elbows up. Who does that? It's John A. Macdonald in the Washington conference saying, wait a minute, you're not going to negotiate without us. He does it again in 1885. Grover Cleveland thinks he's going to negotiate with London, and he says, no, you're not. You're going to deal with Canada. And Grover Cleveland, I cite a document in 1886 saying we have no choice. And now that the railway has been finalized, we really do need to deal with Canada. So I don't buy this notion that that London somehow, telegraphed policy to Canada. I don't think there's a record for that. Macdonald had a love-hate relationship with the Americans. Clearly, his heart was in Great Britain. He's a Scottish boy. He comes to Canada when he's age 5. He's a refugee. He's our first refugee prime minister. He admires Great Britain, but he also knows that the United States is the engine of continental prosperity. And Sir John A. wants free trade with the United States. It's just that the United States, surprise, surprise, does not want sovereign free trade with Canada. And so under his watch, the Americans pull out of free trade, and Macdonald wants free trade, but if the Americans don't want it, well, we're going to have to play the game. And so Sir John A. Macdonald in 1878 installs the national policy, which is the erection of tariff walls. Was it a mistake? The reality is that the economy under Sir John A. Macdonald is not doing very well. There are years when it's better than others. In Quebec, it really hurts hard. The late 80s, early 90s, the recession that's brought upon by American tariff walls is serious. My great-grandfather will migrate to the United States. The Dutil family migrates to New England. There are more Dutils in New England than there are in Quebec today. The vast majority of the family settled in the United States. But my family came back to Montreal, and although they came, it's a long story. Anyway, but they suffered. The family suffered as a result of the economy under Sir John A. But he believed in deficits, he believed in trade, he believed in free trade, but he was frustrated by the Americans. And to his credit, he forged a foreign policy that was respectful of Britain, but at the same time really advancing a notion of an independent Canada that can negotiate on its own and be involved in negotiation.
So I'd mentioned soon after Diefenbaker became prime minister in 1957, he wanted to divert trade away from the United States as a diversification and to assert our independence. He thought we had become far too cozy with the U.S.
Far too dependent on the U.S.
And far too dependent. That policy that he implemented failed because our trade continued to increase in the United States, but that'll give you a sense of where his sentiments were. By the time he got to both the 1962 and 1963 elections, he made those elections about our independence from the United States, first and foremost. So he would say to Canadians, the choice in the election is clear. You're either going to have decisions made about Canada by the Parliament of Canada in Ottawa, or you're going to have decisions made about Canada's future in Washington, D.C. What's it going to be? And at the time, you had the Liberal Party that was increasingly merging its thinking to be in line with John F. Kennedy. They had agreed to reversed policy almost mid-campaign to agree to accept American-controlled nuclear weapons on Canadian soil against the policies that they had been held for a generation to line up with the U.S. When Diefenbaker resisted President Kennedy's insistence that we increase our DEFCON position as part of NORAD, which Diefenbaker signed during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Diefenbaker refused. That created clear animosity between Kennedy and Diefenbaker. And Kennedy was determined to use all means, covert and otherwise, to defeat John Diefenbaker, to the point of sending American generals to Canada to hold a press conference to say that John Diefenbaker was violating the spirit and the letter of NATO and NORAD, to criticize our duly elected Canadian Prime Minister on our soil, and even sent his campaign strategy team, headed by Lou Harris, who had been his chief political advisor, to Canada to advise Lester Pearson, sent him up here on a forged diplomatic passport using Lou Harris's wife's maiden name, so that he wouldn't be seen as being, part of the Liberal campaign apparatus. So, this was Diefenbaker campaigning, and in 62, 63, he was supposed to lose those elections. He still kept the Liberals, at least in 63, to a minority, and again in 65. So I think if he had been, I can't say, I'm not a campaign strategist for today. I'm not here to, to provide a critique. All I can say is, how might Diefenbaker have responded to these current circumstances? And like Mulroney in '84 campaigned on jobs, 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 Diefenbaker in this current election cycle would have campaigned on Canadian independence, Canadian independence, Canadian independence.
And yet at the same time, we need to diversify. Macdonald struggled with it. You know, he talked about how the Continental Railway would allow for better trade with the Chinese. Macdonald talked about it with the Chinese and the Japanese. That was one of the reasons why he wanted a transcontinental railway. Laurier brings in a reciprocity deal, trying to, in this case, trying to take advantage of the American economic might. It swings back and forth. Diefenbaker wanted to diversify. It fails. Trudeau comes in late 60s, early 70s, with the notion that Canada has to end its dependency on the Americans. We're now talking about the same thing. We are constantly oscillating between the continental pull of the Americans, which is mighty. Again, it's a powerful magnet of economic activity. We can't avoid it. We're next door. And at the same time, we have a need to diversify. It's a perennial Canadian struggle.
And Trudeau, that third option that you talk about, it
failed.
did not produce results.
No, it's just fascinating how these issues that were present at the founding
Keep coming back.
The opposition and tension with the United States and even interprovincial trade are back on the forefront after perhaps lying dormant for some decades. So.
Of
Fascinating.
course, Macdonald got to exercise the power of disallowance whenever he liked it, which...
Well, it was mostly on railroads. I mean, he used disallowance on railroads because the provincial governments kept putting up allowing for railways that would compete against the CPR. I mean, the whole thing about the CPR was to give it the means to survive, and the provinces were throwing up, competitors.
But
Understand?
it could have been pipeline.
It could have
And he
been.
might have done the same thing.
It would have been one pipeline.
Only on Canadian soil.
Only on Canadian soil.
Which is what he insisted against all advice to ensure that every mile of that rail line was on Canadian soil. We didn't do that with all our pipelines.
Eventually we did. But
Very good, very good. We could go into much more detail on any of these issues, but one of the main reasons why we're here, and I suspect the reasons why you've written these books, is historical awareness in Canada, or lack thereof, as well as historical education. There seems to be, a growing disregard for history and prevalence of it in our national discourse. What sort of social or cultural trends might explain this? And what are the risks of this kind of, cultural, historical amnesia, or even attempts at erasure?
Gee, I think Charlotte Gray would be the perfect person to answer that question.
Well, I should say, audience
And
questions
Mark Brewery.
in 15 minutes, so get thinking. But
And we're blessed also to have with us today Senator Marjorie Breton, who worked day in, day out with John Diefenbaker, one of the...
In both those elections, 62 and
63. So...
And then 65 on the train. Yeah.
I mean, Canadians are historically illiterate. We don't know our history. We talk about these recurring themes. This is nothing. People don't know this. We don't read about it in our newspapers. It's never ever talked about on the CBC. We do not know our history, and this is enormously weakening to our national fiber. We talk about this desire for independence against the Americans. We are Americans culturally. The vast majority of us consume, in terms of our culture, almost exclusively American product. American television, magazines, books, music, cinema. I mean, we are American, and I defy you to contradict me. Au Québec, c'est différent. There's a difference in Quebec that is fundamental. We are culturally tied to the American view of the world. What can we do to fight that, to somehow solidify our links to each other? Because that's the real challenge. We don't know our own culture. We don't know our own writers. We don't know anything about our history. We don't know anything. The reality is that in this country, there are only 3 provinces that require a credit in Canadian history in order to graduate. Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba. You can graduate high school without ever taking a Canadian history course. That's incredible. This is widely known among educators. The provincial premiers know it. They're not doing a thing about it. And I think, you want to talk about a practical aspect. I mean, in my course on Canadian foreign policy last term, we were studying, I introduced John Diefenbaker and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was a case study. And I was reading the room, and it suddenly occurred to me that I was not getting the vibe I was hoping for, because this is a fascinating story. And I stopped and I said, who among you had never heard of John Diefenbaker before? Because I had a student who couldn't pronounce the name. A third of the hands went up. They had never, these are students in political science, end of fourth year, 21, 22 years old, had never heard of John Diefenbaker. Good luck on your market. I mean, I'm defeated. I'm talking about Macdonald, but man, you got trouble. We need to educate our students, and unless we have the structures to do it, we're not. And I've said this many times. We're killing our own market. If you don't know your history, are you going to watch a movie on Canadian history? How come we don't have any historical drama about Canada? We have tons of stories. I mean, your book could be a movie. I think my books could be a movie. How come we don't have movies? Nobody's talking to me about this. There's so much drama in our books. We don't cover it. There's no market. So movie makers, movie producers are not going to call you. They're not going to call me. Television isn't going to call you. We don't do historical documentary in Canada. We certainly don't broadcast them. We don't give licenses for them. This is a deep-seated problem. Get rid of interprovincial trade. That might be a good thing. But let's insist on having a requirement that a teenager understand Canadian history, or at least the broad outlines of it. It shouldn't just be something. Thank you.
So I agree with everything you said. But you brought up 3 provinces who do have mandatory training, but from my experience, that training and education in Canadian history is mostly about what's wrong about Canada.
Absolutely.
It is not really the history of Canada.
Yep.
And here we've kind of been, bad-mouthing somewhat the United States and their manifest destiny. From my observation, they do a better job of documenting and understanding their history. If you ask that, at a university level, political affairs, if they'd ever heard of John F. Kennedy, who was the contemporary of Diefenbaker, they all would have said yes, probably the same thing with Eisenhower. You will see documentaries, extensive documentaries on all sorts of episodes and histories in the United States that are widely held. I would say that the top-selling history books in the United States will sell far more than 10 times what they would sell here in Canada. So there is an appetite for it in the United States. Perhaps they've got a higher sense of pride. I don't know what is the origins of this, but they do a far better job and they invest more. I had made a proposal to Netflix to do exactly, a series of documentaries about Canada when at the beginning of the Trump era, when everyone said we need more Canada, and we went to them and I went with Peter Mansbridge and Rob Russo as a team to do these documentaries, and they said there's no market for that.
Yeah, there's no market for it.
There's no
You
interest
talk
in
about
it.
Kennedy. At least Kennedy had Jackie, and I recently saw a documentary on Jackie, and it was really well done. We need a documentary on Olive.
Yeah.
This is
Surely
what it
there's
can
something
take
about
to
Olive
reinvigorate
Diefenbaker
interest in
we could be
Canadian
writing
history.
about.
Although his first wife might have been even more interesting.
But she's fascinating.
Well, yeah, you
Edna.
clearly agree that it's an issue, and interesting points, Bob, about the U.S. They have a very clear attachment to their founding, and they're kind of historically oriented as a result. I'm wondering what you make of the idea that, and you reference this as well, the history that is taught is critical. The idea that liberal or progressive society, an excessively liberal progressive society, one might say, is critical of its history. It wants to be liberated from its history. Even the liberal streams, I think we see this to varying degree in other societies around the Western world. They're committed to abstractions. They kind of distance from authority, respect for tradition, these sorts of things. It's all kind of about the person and improving and striving beyond and forgetting and attachment to forebears, attachment even to place, right, is kind of seen as passé. And so I wonder how, do you really think in light of that being, so very clearly, I would say the mainstream view, characteristic of Canadian society, that a really robust historical understanding and appreciation can flourish?
I'm optimistic that it can. I think we have just come through 10 years where we've had a prime minister that was leading with apologies, not leading with what is foundational to the country and its success and its accomplishments. Diefenbaker loved the CBC and hated it at the same time. He thought we needed a national institution to tell our stories, to help bind us together. What distressed him to no end was that they had adopted an internationalist mindset. Now, this is going back 20, 30 years ago, where Canada was a bit passé. They were taking the side of the Americans more so, that there was virtue there and progress there, and we were somewhat backward. And he thought the Canadian story should be told. And he was a great historian himself. He loved to, celebrate historical figures, all the way through. But leadership is important in this. The tone is set, at the top about what, who gets defended and why, how history is put in context. It's not that everything we did was perfect, but we don't have to suffer from the disease of presentism in all that we see. So, I having studied many of our historical figures, I think there's a lot to be admired. And they can be criticized, certainly, but I think the progress that they made in their time was commendable. And Canadian progress relative to a number of other countries around the world is also commendable. And they can't change that fact or circumstance. So, I'm always hopeful with each new leader and each new government and each new generation of Canadians that they'll be open to looking at our past in a more fair-minded and appreciative way.
I'm not. I'm very pessimistic. The complaint we share in this room, is a complaint you'll hear in Britain, in France, in Germany, even in the United States. Although there's an elite in the United States that will defend history, there's PBS that will commission documentaries from Ken Burns constantly. We don't have that in this country. And there are forces among us that actively fight it. And it's nothing personal. We are living in a very individualized society. We are losing touch with each other. This is a remarkable event. But you have to go to various local history societies where you'll find this kind of thing. And it's typically really older people. We don't.
Not this group.
Not this group. We don't. I was a president of the Champlain Society for 8 years. The average member was 85. The only time we lost membership was when they passed away. Sort of like the CBC audience. But in an atomized society like ours, in an individualized society, we lose the links with each other, first of all. And one of the things that unites us with each other is a shared history. We don't do that. In an atomized society like ours, history is bound to erode and even disappear. I read a French historian recently who said that our contact with our grandparents, the fact that young people today don't have the kind of contact with their grandparents that we did, certainly that I did, or others where the grandparents lived in the home, multi-general homes. We don't have that anymore, where you could actually hear about, in the old days, this is how we did things. You don't hear that anymore. There's no organic attachment to the past. So the forces against a historical awareness are titanic, titanic. And unless we can muster, the premiers of our provinces to insist on teaching history, I'm not asking for a fairy tale history. I'm just talking about history, ordinary history, true history, complete history, include the Indigenous people, include the multicultural nature of Canada. Do all these things, but insist on it. And force the CBC to pay attention to history. Commend Telefilm Canada to provide more funding for historical things. Talk about our culture. These are petty little things that should be done, and yet here we are talking about it because it's not being done.
So you are optimistic.
No,
you
I'm
got planned.
I think so.
And you wouldn't have put the thousands of hours into that book if you didn't have a little bit of optimism in you.
Only because I know you're going to read it, because you were goading me on. Say, finish with this book so you'll read it.
When's the book coming out? I would say every couple of months.
He was a great sustainer.
That's amazing. Last question for me, and let's go to
Yeah,
the audience.
Mark's got a question.
You already were listing some, concrete things that, policymakers, educators, et cetera, can do. If you have anything more to add on that front, Patrice or Bob, I'd love to hear from you both. What can we do to improve historical literacy and reception, all that?
I think that the only thing we can do is when we meet a politician, insist on it. I'm with a group of friends, and we're trying to get people to pay attention to the fact that there is a wonderful statue of Egerton Ryerson that was taken down with violence 4 years ago. I can't get anybody to pay any attention to this. This was a fabulous monument. If you don't like Egerton Ryerson, fine. But is there a reason why this monumental figure in the history of Ontario, whose accomplishments would take me 15 minutes to itemize, has been denigrated and literally buried? Why is it so hard for us to get the attention? The media doesn't want to talk to us. The politicians don't even answer our letters or our phone calls. I'm talking about school trustees, school principals. Queen's Park, Queen's Park is undergoing a massive renovation. Why cannot the founder of Ontario's educational system be honored at the provincial park? It's absurd. So little things like that. So my point is, you got to talk to the politicians and say, why are you playing this game of assuming that Canada's history is unworthy? I don't understand.
All it takes is courage.
Well, that's a rare commodity.
Very good. I'm sure we could continue to, capacious historical minds. There's lots in there, and I know we have more questions, so hopefully, Patrice and Bob will stick around a bit to discuss with everyone. I want to thank you all for coming. It's very important and timely discussion. I think with, some of the U.S.-Canada issues, we see through this that, our history lives with us. Very much the same issues that have formed the country present today. And I want to thank you both.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
for coming.
Thank you to MLI.